Hi, everybody, and welcome back to U University. I'm Dr. Kelly. Gosh, school has been keeping me super busy again these past couple of weeks. We are in the midst of graduate admissions, and I'm the chair of the graduate committee. So we've been reviewing applicant files and meeting a lot. But other than that, my classes have been great, and everything's going smoothly. Our weather is showing signs of spring being on the way. And one of the characteristics of spring is wide variability in weather as we make the transition from winter to summer. In the past week, we've had a snowstorm, thunderstorms, an ice storm, dense fog, and a few sunny, nice days like today. But luckily, no bad weather really impacted my commute or anything like that. The most unfortunate thing was that the snowstorm we had last Saturday occurred when I was on my way down to the Peoria area to go to the Knitting Pipeline Retreat. It's only about an hour away, and I was looking forward to seeing friends and meeting some new people, as well as shopping for yarn at the vendor marketplace there. Well, I got about 20 miles from home and found myself in the middle of a blizzard. It was snowing heavily, and at times you couldn't even see the road. The interstate was completely snow covered and getting icy, so I decided that I was going to turn around and come back home. And that 20 miles took me like an hour to get back home. There were cars in the ditch all over the place, but I made it home with no incident, thank goodness. But I was really disappointed that I wasn't able to get to the retreat. I know that some of you were there, and I was excited to be able to see you, but we'll have to postpone that until next time. So, okay, for today's show, the topic is circular knitting machines, which is something that I've been interested in for many years. You all know my friend Anne. You probably remember her. I've introduced her in a previous video, and she has several circular knitting machines. So I've had many opportunities to see them in action. And I love watching them work, and I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit about the background on these machines and getting a little demonstration of how they work. But first, before we go into the classroom, I have a book review for you. So let's get right into that. Today I'm going to be reviewing an audiobook that I recently finished, which is entitled Enchantress of Numbers by Jennifer Cheverini. I've read one of Jennifer Cheverini's previous books, and that is Mrs. Lincoln's Dressmaker, which I really enjoyed, so I thought this one would probably be pretty good as well. Enchantress of Numbers tells the story of Ada Byron King, the Countess of Lovelace, who was the daughter of the famous poet Lord Byron. She was born in England in 1815 and witnessed in her lifetime numerous technological advancements. These inventions and discoveries, combined with her remarkable intellect, provided the impetus for her own great work, conceptualizing the first computing algorithm. So she's kind of considered the mother of computer science. This novel covers nearly all of Ada's life. It starts off with a lengthy prologue that details the relationship between Ada's parents, Lord Byron and Lady Annabella, and their short, disastrous marriage. Soon after Ada's birth, the couple split, and Lord Byron left England, never to return or see his daughter again. A lot of attention is given to Ada's youth, describing how her well-meaning but overprotective mother does everything humanly possible to prevent Ada from having any fun or fantasy, forbidding her from reading poetry, and weeding out imagination entirely from Ada's life and education. This feels so cruel as Ada yearns for fairy tales and information about her father. Instead, her mother steers Ada toward everything practical and logical, surrounding Ada with tutors and governesses who didn't tolerate anything but discipline and learning, specifically in mathematics and science. Now, fortunately, Ada excelled in these subjects from an early age. Ada had a complicated relationship with her mother and never really knew her father until long after he was deceased. Emotionally neglected and lonely, Ada often protested her mother's severe parenting. However, as she grows older, she seems to develop a greater understanding of why her mother was so strict with her, and perhaps even an appreciation of her mother's push for her education. Without it, Ada never would have been encouraged to study high-level mathematics, which was generally viewed at that time to be beyond the ability of a mere woman. As Ada matures, she does find mentors and close friends. One of them was Charles Babbage, a scientist and inventor of the difference engine and the analytical engine, which were basically very early precursors of modern-day calculators and computers. Ada worked with him to try to bring his inventions to fruition. And one of her greatest contributions to this end was the idea of how to program these early computers to do calculations. She conceived the idea of using punch cards, which was inspired by watching how jacquard weaving looms worked. Okay, so what did I think of this book? Well, first of all, before I read it, I had never heard of Ada Byron King or her contributions to computer science. This is exactly the type of book I love picking up, one that brings lesser-known historical figures to life. Cheverini's research was clearly voluminous. This novel really showcases Ada's talents, drive, determination, and details of her life, including many scenes of aristocratic society and technological demonstrations. I think the characters of Ada and her mother are very well written and provide the novel's greatest strength. The one weakness in this novel is probably that it reads like an autobiography with a slightly formal tone. I'm sure Cheverini intentionally framed it that way, capturing Ada's life year by year from infancy to just before her death. She even uses lines from Lord Byron's poetry as chapter titles, charting Ada's discovery of her own talents and acceptance of her father's influence. And this gives the reader a more complete picture of the joys and hardships that shape Ada's character, but at the expense of plot. You won't feel the pull of an ever-deepening conflict building to some climax. Instead, the story is compelling because of Ada, her personality, and accomplishments. Unfortunately, she lived during a time when women's ideas and intelligence were still believed to be inferior to that of men. She had to fight to get her ideas listened to, and even after proving her ideas would work, she was still surrounded by doubters. And those were the parts of the book that were hard to read. But if you love historical fiction and want a glimpse into the dawn of technological revolution, or if you're looking for a novel that provides a comprehensive portrait of a character by following them through their entire life, or even if you're just a STEM enthusiast, then you'll probably enjoy this book. I love that Jennifer Cheverini is bringing Ada's story to light. Ada played an important role in history, and one that I think should be highlighted, especially for our young girls today. So I'm giving this book 4 stars. The audiobook reader, Virginia Leishman, was good, so I'm going to give her 4 stars as well. And again, that book is Enchantress of Numbers by Jennifer Cheverini. Okay, today in the classroom, we are talking about circular knitting machines. As you no doubt already know, circular knitting, or knitting in the round, is a form of knitting that creates a seamless tube. In circular knitting, you cast on a number of stitches, and then the circle of stitches is joined. The knitting progresses in rounds as a spiral. Now, originally, circular knitting was done using a set of 4 or 5 double-pointed needles. Later, circular needles were invented, which have two short knitting needle tips connected by a cable in between them. Machines can also produce circular knitting, and many hand knitters have thought of purchasing a circular knitting machine for faster and more efficient production. In fact, I've been noticing over the past few years a big resurgence in popularity of circular knitting machines, especially for sock knitting. And in fact, sock knitting was the impetus for the first knitting machines. Back in the 1500s, knitters in Spain and France started to produce very fine knitted silk stockings with tiny little stitches. Originally, stockings were sewn from two pieces of woven fabric, usually wool, that were cut against the bias to give the fabric some stretch. A third piece of fabric formed the bottom of the foot. Knitted silk stockings were more comfortable and fit better than woven stockings, and soon rich people everywhere wanted them. Now that everybody wanted knit stockings, manufacturers were trying to figure out ways to make them faster and cheaper. Weaving looms had been used for centuries, so why couldn't something similar be made to create knitting? Well, knitting is more complicated to perform than weaving, so it was difficult to design a machine to create knit stitches. But in 1589, William Lee, a British minister, did it. He invented the first knitting machine, which was called the stocking frame. In Lee's stocking frame, a row of stationary needles is held horizontally in an iron bed surrounded by a huge wooden frame similar to a weaver's loom. This machine produced flat stockinette stitch that was then joined together to make a sock and stitched up the back and under the foot. Lee's invention depended on the use of what's called the spring bearded needle. The bearded needle consists of 5 parts. First is the head, which is the hooked portion of the stem of the needle, which catches the new yarn, forms a loop, and draws it through the old loop. The beard is the continuation of the hooked portion. It is springy and is used to separate the new loop of yarn inside from the old loop as it slides off the needle. The eye is a groove cut in the stem to receive the pointed tip of the beard when it is pressed in so that the new yarn loop is trapped there. The stem is the main body of the needle around which the yarn loop is formed. Finally, the shank end is bent for placement into the machine. The bearded needle was the first needle which was able to replicate hand knitting with 2 needles on a single needle. One important feature of the bearded needle is that external pressure is needed to close the beard and allow the new stitch to form. To use the stocking frame, a person would sit in front of it, similar to working on a weaving loom. Using a series of hand levers and foot pedals, the operator would raise and lower the rows of needles as well as apply the presser bar to close the beard so that the old rows of stitches could be pushed safely off the needles. This video shows a demonstration of a later version of the stocking frame, which was wider than the original model and could make multiple stockings at once. Lee's design remained virtually unchanged until the 1700s, when it was modified to include a ribbing attachment, which could be used to make rib socks and garter stitch. By this time, factories were spreading throughout Europe, England, and America. For years, people had thought about making a circular knitting machine. Wouldn't it be great to knit socks in the round, and then you wouldn't have to seam up the bottoms and the backs of the socks? But the sticking point of further development of circular knitting frames was always the bearded needle. Because the bearded needle needs external pressure to close, this was very limiting as far as how you could set up the needles. And that's why knitting frames to this point had always been flatbeds. That flatbed allowed a presser bar to come into contact with the needle beards to close them. And nobody could figure out how to accomplish this process with a circular knitting machine. It wasn't until 1849 when these problems were solved by Matthew Townsend. Townsend's father was a framework knitter, so he had grown up around this process his whole life. And as an adult, he was a hosiery manufacturer himself. What Townsend did was put two previous unrelated inventions together and made them work. About 30 years prior, Marc Brunel, a French engineer, had built a knitting machine that arranged the needles in a circular form rather than in a flatbed. But it never took off because it had so many problems. Townsend tweaked this knitting machine, this circular knitting machine, by making one crucial change. Instead of bearded needles, he incorporated latch needles. Now, the latch needle had been patented in 1806 in France by Pierre Jandot, but it had never been developed into a successful working needle. Townsend realized that a latch needle, which eliminated the need for external pressure on the needle, could be used not only in flatbed knitting machines, but also circular machines. And it would be way easier to use in double-headed machines to form both knit and purl stitches or ribbing. Townsend improved Jandot's original design and patented his modifications. The latch needle consists of 4 parts. First, there is the stem, which is the straight body that forms the main part of the needle. The shank is the bottom section of the needle that is attached to the bed of the knitting machine. The hook is the upper end segment of the stem. It picks up the yarn fed by the thread guide to form a stitch. Finally, there is the latch, which swings on a rivet just below the hook. The latch needle forms a stitch with simple up and down movements. These needles are called self-acting in that they do not require any outside force to close the hook. The latch swings freely. It opens when the old stitch moves down the stem, allowing the working yarn to be grabbed by the hook, and then the old stitch moves back up the stem, closing the latch and forming the new stitch. The latch needle is more versatile than the bearded needle. It can be placed in any position, even sideways or upside down. But the drawbacks are that it is slightly wider than the bearded needle because of that rivet, so it can't knit as fine of a gauge as the bearded needle. Plus, it is more expensive to manufacture because of the assembly of the needle and latch. Still, the latch needle was particularly valuable for circular knitting machines where it was pretty much impossible to apply an outside force to close the bearded needles during the knitting process. So circular knitting really took off, especially in the United States after Townsend moved to New England. The first great boost to circular machine knitting came during the American Civil War when Army commanders realized that socks made with circular machines were far better than the ones knit on flatbed frames that were seamed up the bottom and the back. At that time, the socks were made in factories where children as young as 4 years old cranked out lengths of plain knitted tubes, and then the heels and toes would be shaped by hand knitting. Eventually, the circular sock machines were adapted for back and forth operations so that heels and toes could be done directly on the machines. Another huge advantage of the circular knitting machines was that they were compact, taking up a lot less space than the large knitting frames that had been previously used. So circular knitting machines could be used at home as well as in factory environments. The next major enhancement of the circular knitting machine was in 1878. Henry Griswold introduced a second set of needles in a disc that fit on top of the existing circle of needles. This second set of needles enabled rib knitting, like for the cuff of socks. The needles around the outside would produce knit stitches, while the needles on the inner circle would knit purl stitches. So you could set up the machine to do, say, 2x2 ribbing, where 2 of the outer needles would perform the knit stitch, and 2 of the inside needles would perform the purl stitch, and so on. The ribber disc was really the last important development in the evolution of circular knitting machines. The circular sock knitting machine gained popularity again during World War I. Soldiers in the field were desperately in need of knitted goods like sweaters and mufflers, but the most important knitted goods that were needed were socks. Dry socks were crucial to the health of the troops. Thousands of soldiers fighting in the trenches in France were badly crippled by trench foot, which is a life-threatening infection triggered by exposure to cold, wet conditions for long periods of time. The soldiers wearing tight, uninsulated boots would stand in cold water and mud, causing the tissue in the foot to decay. And this could happen in as little as 1 day. It's kind of like frostbite, except that trench foot can arise without freezing temperatures. And prompt treatment is necessary because neglected trench foot can quickly turn into gangrene and even death. Many soldiers lost a foot or a leg to trench foot. So this was a very serious issue that needed to be handled right away. The only remedy for trench foot was for the soldiers to dry their feet and change their socks several times a day. By the end of 1915, soldiers in the trenches had to have 3 pairs of socks with them and were under orders to change their socks at least twice a day. Therefore, the provision of dry socks was vitally important, and I think you can see where I'm going with this. Sock factories couldn't keep up with the volume needed. So to meet the demand, knitters at home made a relentless effort. Over 150,000 circular sock machines were given to knitters in the US and Canada, and they learned how to use them at Red Cross headquarters across the country. In their training, they learned how to knit a perfect pair of socks in 40 minutes. At the time, wool was being rationed, and in September 1918, all American yarn retailers were ordered to turn over their stock of yarn to the Red Cross. And from this supply, each knitter was allocated enough wool yarn to make 30 pairs of socks. Now, after the war, circular sock machines continued to be used in rural households. Knitting was a constant occupation during the Great Depression. The knitting machine companies advertised the machines as a way for women to make money from home. At that time, a circular sock machine could be purchased for $47. But the companies provided the yarn and purchased the socks back from the women for resale to department stores. During World War II, the Red Cross recruited home knitters again with circular sock machines to make socks for soldiers. However, later on during the war, metal was in such short supply that home knitters who owned circular sock machines were asked to turn them in to be melted down to recycle the metal for the war effort. And this is why there are not a lot of vintage sock machines left. Now, over the past 20 years, there seems to have been a resurgence of interest in knitting with circular knitting machines. And one of the companies that currently makes circular knitting machines is the Erlbacher Knitting Machine Company in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. This company arose out of a family-run machine shop where the owner, David Erlbacher, bought an old Gearhart circular sock machine from 1924 that was missing a lot of parts. After playing around with it to get it to work, he ended up patenting the first Gearhart sock knitting machine made in the US in nearly 100 years and started making modern replicas of the Gearhart machine. And that's how the Erlbacher Knitting Machine Company was born. I recently sat down with Jamie Mayfield, the daughter of David Erlbacher, and we talked about the circular knitting machines that are available from the Erlbacher Company. And she also gave a demonstration on how to use these machines, showing how fast and easy it is to make socks and other items. So in the upcoming video, she's going to show us 2 models of circular sock machines and also introduce their newest circular machine called the Bumblebee, which is larger in circumference. So let's go on over to the workshop and hear what Jamie has to tell us about these fascinating knitting machines. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay. My name is Jamie Mayfield, and I am from the Erlbacher Knitting Machine Company in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. My dad started his machine shop in the 1960s, and he was hyperactive, and he needed a project. And he saw a machine like this, and he said, I can make that because it's round and because it caught his eye. And so he said, I will have one of those made in 60 days. And it was a year and a month later that we had one made. And we had lots of help from people that were experts, or they still are experts on the antique machines. They came and they visited with us, and they really helped us get started. And I don't know, when you watch these machines knit, it's just mesmerizing. And if you're ever knitting, like a demoing at a fair or something, the ornery little boys will come and knit on these machines for an hour. And their parents will be like, come on, we're leaving. And they're like, no, I'm busy. Come on, we're leaving. I mean, and my dad, that's what he was. Mm-hmm. He was an ornery little boy. And so he did. He made the machine.
What's the Gerhardt connection with the
Gerhardt
machines?
was the antique machine that we reproduced. Okay. That was the first machine that we reproduced. The first Gerhardt that was made was wooden, and it was itty bitty tiny, and it was so precious. There aren't very many of those around. And remember, it had the small crank handle. And one day my dad was at church, and he figured out how to make this machine have a 1-to-1 crank or the small handle. You can have your choice. If you want either one, you can have a red reduced ratio or a green and yellow speedster. It doesn't matter. And so that kind of revolutionized our machine because you have your choice. So the Speedster, which is our most popular model, it got its name when my dad figured out, he was in church, not listening, just want to point that out, and he figured out how to make the 1-to-1 handle. And that weekend, there was like one of those antique car rallies coming through town, and they all parked downtown, and there was a little red Speedster, and there was a sign. It was from 1934 or some, I don't know the year, and it was a Speedster, and he said, that's what I'm going to name my machine. And especially since it's a family business, it's his machine, and he can name it whatever he wants to. This is the first model. We call it the reduced ratio machine.
So you can see that the crank is a lot smaller.
Correct. But that means that watch my arm when I crank. It's just my elbow. Now watch my arm when I crank here. Okay? This is the bumblebee. It is a hat machine. It's what it's designed for. We have 3 choices of cylinders. You can get a 60, a 72, or a 90. Now I'm going to show you these hats right here.
And the number is how many needles are in the cylinder.
And that is equivalent to what you would cast on. So this is, I have my hair thing on. So this is made on the 90, okay? But this is also made on the 90, and the tension was way loose. Okay? It's just like regular knitting. Everybody has a different gauge. Okay, when you buy a machine from us, it's kind of shocking for people because we're a small business and we're just like you guys, you know? These machines aren't sitting on a shelf somewhere. When you call on the telephone, someone's going to answer it, or else the answering machine get it. It's not a fancy voicemail system, you know. And you get me or my sister or our bookkeeper. But the thing of it is these machines are built per order. You know, we don't have them sitting somewhere in a warehouse getting dusty and we're waiting to sell them. That's just not the way it works. The other thing is we sell all our machines for the same price because we feel like if we give somebody a discount and the next guy doesn't get a discount, that's not fair to that next guy. So we sat down and we decided what is a fair price for this machine, and everybody pays the same price for the machine, and we don't ever put them on sale.
So you don't do wholesale orders?
No, we don't, because we don't have distributors, because we don't have an excessive amount of machines that we're trying to sell. Okay? We're just trying to keep up with the orders that we have.
Now, are there certain kinds of yarn that you recommend for your machines?
The cotton and silk and linen and hemp, they don't work because they don't stretch. So if you're going to use those kinds of yarn, you have to mix them with something that stretches, because it's no fun to knit with yarn that doesn't stretch. Now, let me show you something here, because this is a common question I get asked. They want to know, people want to know what weight of yarn. You have to be able to fit 2 thicknesses of yarn plus a needle into the slot. Okay? So this is a 90 needle slot. You're going to be using thinner yarn than this guy at a 60 needle slot. You see how much wider that is than this right here? Okay? So on the 60 needle, you can use a lot thicker yarn than you can on the 90. And then the choices are 90, 72, and 60. And if somebody's only going to pick one, I say pick the 72 because it's right there in the middle.
Let's talk about the setup bonnet. Does that come with your machine, or do you make this yourself?
Well, there's a setup bonnet that comes with every machine, but we recommend the setup bonnet is a great first project.
It looks like this one looks like a bumblebee.
I know.
Is that on purpose?
Yes. Because my friend Sue decided if we were going to sell a bumblebee, they were going to get bumblebee setup bonnets.
And that's what you attach the waste yarn to, and that
in order
starts your
to
project.
thread the machine,
Yeah.
yes. Because I was knitting with the wrong arm.
Is this the top of the hat?
This is the top of the hat. And you're going to be able to see it here in just a second. So what I'm going to do is gather these loops, gather it at the top. Get this waste yarn away from here. And then it can be pulled down to come over the ears,
and then just
or it just rolls up. Now, before we want to make sure we caught all the loops, and then we'll just see how to close it all up. But we make hats, gloves, mittens, teddy bears, pumpkins, apples, comfort dolls, socks. We make socks.
So these machines are not just for
Not
socks?
just socks and hats, no. You think it up, we'll figure out how to do it, pretty much. So there's our hat.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that little excursion, discussion, and demonstration of modern circular knitting machines. As you saw in that video, the Erlbacher Company manufactures circular knitting machines in various sizes, and with them, you can create smaller circumference items like socks, as well as larger circumference items like hats. And of course, as Jamie said, there are numerous other items you can make with these circular knitting machines as well. If you're interested in checking them out, I'll put a link to the company's website in the information box below. I will also put a link to the Erlbacher Company's Facebook page in case you want to keep up with the company's activities, like the upcoming Crank-In that they host every April. And a Crank-In is just a gathering of people who use circular knitting machines. The Erlbacher Company also has an awesome YouTube channel with tutorials on how to use their various circular knitting machines, so I'll include a link to their YouTube channel down below as well. Again, thank you so much to Jamie Mayfield for coming up to Illinois from Cape Girardeau, Missouri to talk to us and demonstrate the circular knitting machines. And thank you so much to my friend Anne who introduced me to Jamie. And now it's your turn to go down to the comment section and tell me about your experiences with circular knitting machines. Do you have one or do you want one? If you already have one, what kind do you have and how do you like it? And what kinds of things do you make with it? Or if you don't already have one, is it something you're interested in trying out? What are you thinking about getting? I'd love to hear your thoughts about circular knitting machines. Well, that brings us to the end of today's show. I hope you found this episode on circular knitting machines to be thought-provoking and useful. As always, I will include links to everything I talked about today in the information box below. Just click on Show More to open up the box and you'll see all the links there. Please also let me know in the comments section if you have any questions about today's show, any ideas for future videos, or product tests. I always enjoy hearing from you, and even if I can't respond to your comments right away, I do always read every remark you make. And I so appreciate the dialogue that follows every one of my videos. It creates such a positive sense of community, so please keep it up. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today, and I'll see you in the next video. Next week, I have some yarns to talk about. And these yarns are new for 2018 and kind of different in some way, so I thought it would be interesting to showcase them. I hope you'll join me for that next week, and until then, stay smart and have a sparkly week.